My daughter told the florist to start taking measurements for a charity gala in the West Ballroom. That by itself would not have meant much. What made me stop on the front steps of Rosehall was the sight of 3 strangers in black gloves moving through my late wife's music room with orange inventory tags and a laser measure, while my son-in-law stood behind the long velvet curtain in the front parlor and watched me pull into the drive without coming outside to greet me. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you are watching from. It helps this story reach more people who understand how family, money, and trust can become dangerous when the wrong person gets too close. One of the strangers had already tied a bright orange string around Eleanor's mahogany escritoire, the one she bought at auction the year we were broke enough to be sensible and foolish enough to buy beauty anyway. Another was kneeling beside the Steinway in the corner, photographing its legs, its brass casters, and the small nick on the fallboard that only family knew how to find. They were not admiring anything. They were recording removal condition. That is the sort of detail most people would miss. I did not miss it because I spent 32 years as a museum registrar. I know the difference between people who love old things and people who are preparing them to leave the building. Rosehall, with its stone terraces, conservatory, orchard wall, and 7-bedroom main house, had been appraised at $8.6 million the winter before. The contents alone, if anyone had been monstrous enough to separate them from the house, were worth just over $940,000. And every single one of those people was moving through the rooms as if somebody had already decided what stayed, what went, and what could be turned into cash by the end of the month. Dean saw me. I know he saw me. The curtain shifted. His face appeared for 1 second in the gap between the folds, then disappeared, as if I were the one who had arrived where I did not belong. That was the moment my stomach went cold. Not because strangers were in the house. Because Dean Halstead was the sort of man who came out smiling even when he was lying. If he stayed hidden, it meant the lie was not ready yet. My name is Walter Mercer. I am 69 years old. I was widowed 9 years ago. I live alone in a brick townhouse 32 minutes from Rosehall if the light in Greenwood behaves and no one in a pickup truck mistakes the county road for a racetrack. I have 1 daughter, Vanessa, and 1 granddaughter, Olive, who was 9 that spring and still believed that every locked drawer in the world contained either treasure or peppermint. Rosehall was never supposed to be a battleground. It began as a promise. My wife Eleanor found the house the way some people find a calling, by accident and then all at once. We had driven west one Sunday in late October to look at a smaller property with a decent roofline and absolutely no soul. On the way back, she turned down a side road because she saw the top of an old glass conservatory behind a line of cypress trees. At the end of that lane sat Rosehall, half asleep under ivy and neglect, too proud to collapse and too damaged to be easy. The main house dated back to the 1880s. The west wing had been badly altered in the 1950s. The carriage house roof sagged. The orchard wall was bowing. The plaster medallions in the music room had hairline cracks. Every practical part of my mind said we should keep driving. Eleanor stopped the car and smiled at the house like she had just been introduced to someone she already loved. We did not buy it then. We could not have. Olive was not even born yet. Vanessa was still deciding whether she loved event design or merely the kind of dresses event designers got to wear, and Eleanor and I still had a mortgage on our old place in town. But Rosehall stayed in our marriage the way certain ideas do. It became one of those sentences people keep. Returning to over dinner. If we ever had the money. If we ever had the time. If we were ever foolish enough. Then Eleanor got sick. I will not give you every hospital detail. I have lived long enough to know that grief deserves privacy even when the story around it is public. I will tell you only what matters. Pancreatic cancer. Fast. Efficient. 1 year from diagnosis to funeral. He spent the first half of that year pretending he still had time and the second half deciding what had to remain after him. 2 weeks before she died, when the morphine had not yet blurred her voice and her mind was still entirely her own, she asked me to sit by the window in our bedroom and listen carefully. She said our daughter needed more than money. She said Vanessa loved beauty and scale and old houses and parties that looked effortless only because somebody had sweated blood to make them so. She said Rosehall had come back to her 3 nights in a row in dreams, which was unlike her. Eleanor was not mystical. She believed in contracts and gutters and replacing systems before they failed. But there she was, gaunt and tired and serious, saying my name as if she needed me to lift something after she was gone. If Rosehall ever comes back around, he told me, don't let some hotel group turn it into a membership club. Don't let a man in bad loafers scrape the soul out of it. Give Vanessa something rooted. Give our girls a place that belongs to them before the world starts charging admission for everything decent. I said I would. That is the terrible thing about promises made to dying people. They enter you whole. Years can pass and you still obey them as if the room is warm and their hand is still in yours. Eleanor died 11 days later just before dawn while rain tapped the windows in that irritating soft way spring rain does when it intends to last all morning. Vanessa was 32. Olive was 6 months old. Dean stood in the hallway in a navy suit and held our diaper bag while I signed forms with a pen that tore through the paper because my hand would not stop shaking. When I think back now, I can still see him there. Quiet. Useful. Attentive. The kind of son-in-law a grieving man thanks God for because he appears steady and generous at the exact moment the world has become an unstable floor. I did thank God for him. That was one of several errors I made. Vanessa met Dean at a fundraising supper held in the sculpture garden of the museum where I worked. That was 13 years before the orange tags. She had come late from an event job carrying a box of escort cards and a stapler between her teeth because she was 28 and thought exhaustion was a personality trait. Dean had come with a donor couple from Charlottesville and walked through the evening as if he belonged equally in every room he entered. By the time dessert came out, Vanessa was laughing at something he had said about hotel guests and hydrangeas, and I remember seeing them across the lawn under the paper lanterns and thinking they looked well matched in the easy superficial way fathers are trained to notice first. Dean knew how to make women around him feel briefly more competent than they had 5 minutes earlier. That was one of his best skills. He would ask a question, listen with his whole face, then repeat back the part of your answer that made you sound smartest. Vanessa adored that in the beginning because she had spent years feeling half-finished next to louder women with cleaner resumes. Dean never made her feel half-finished. He made her feel inevitable. I do not think that was false at the start. This matters to me. I am old enough to know that evil rarely begins in pure form. Dean loved Vanessa in the way ambitious men often love beautiful capable women early on, as confirmation, as audience, as future, as luck. They married the following August under a white tent on a vineyard lawn. Eleanor cried discreetly during the vows and later insisted she had dust in one eye. Dean danced with me at the reception and said he knew Vanessa had grown up inside. Standards most men would find intimidating, but he hoped I could see how fiercely he intended to build a life around her. I believed him because grief had not yet entered the marriage and because it is easier, when you still have your husband beside you, to imagine that promises made by younger people will remain stable under weather. Then Olive was born, and the first cracks arrived in forms too ordinary to call cracks. Dean missed a pediatric appointment because of work. He forgot an anniversary dinner and sent peonies large enough to pass for remorse. He spoke of money as flow rather than obligation and once told Eleanor, at our table, that debt was only dangerous when men got emotional about it. Eleanor looked at him over his soup and said the problem with that theory was that banks rarely confuse emotion for payment. Dean laughed. Eleanor did not. Years later, after Eleanor died and I had too much time to review small memories under stronger light, I realized my wife had seen something long before I did. Not villainy exactly. Slippage. A man who believed there would always be one more deal, one more friend, one more woman in the room willing to cover the gap between what he wanted and what he had actually secured. After the funeral, Dean became almost indispensable for 6 months. He drove Vanessa to appointments she was too exhausted to remember. He handled the florist bills from the service without asking me a question that week because he correctly judged that my kindness had gone septic and could not bear another practical conversation. He moved Olive's crib twice when Vanessa decided one room had too much light and another did not enough. He showed up. Showing up is the most persuasive disguise betrayal has. By the time Rosehall was in restoration, Dean had learned something useful about me. I can forgive a great deal in a person who appears reliable during grief. Competence under sorrow purchases years of benefit of the doubt. He spent that currency carefully at first. He offered contractor referrals. He walked site visits in boots that stayed suspiciously clean. He stood with me in half-finished rooms and said the right things about honoring Eleanor's eye. Sometimes I even believed he meant them. Vanessa, for her part, changed at Rosehall in ways that made me want to reward her without calculation. She rose into the work the way certain vines rise once they finally find the correct wall. She could look at an empty conservatory and imagine the dinner. She could stand in the service hall with 3 florists, a pastry chef, and an anxious mother of the bride and somehow leave everyone feeling she had chosen them specifically to be capable that day. I loved watching her become legible to herself. That may be the most dangerous emotion parents feel around adult children. Relief. Relief makes you generous. Generosity, unless structured, makes you vulnerable. The summer before Dean turned truly reckless, he and Vanessa hosted a dinner on the lower terrace for 12 potential corporate clients. After dessert, while the guests were wandering the garden with port in hand, Dean stood beside the old fountain and spoke to a venture friend of his in a tone he thought was private. I was inside the open French doors folding place cards back into a box and heard him say Rosehall was underleveraged for what it could become. Underleveraged. Not underused. Not underpromoted. Underleveraged. He caught me in the doorway afterward and smiled in that mild surprised way he used whenever he wanted to imply that only a very suspicious person would have heard anything amiss. I let it pass because the clients were still on the terrace and because I wanted one more season of peace more than I wanted the truth early. That was another of several errors I made. When Rosehall came up for sale 3 years later, it felt less like luck than a summons. The heirs had no interest in restoring it. The taxes were a burden. A developer had already circled once with drawings for a wellness retreat that would have turned the orchard into parking and the music room into a bar with custom lighting. I sold a commercial building Eleanor and I owned downtown. I emptied an investment account I had once believed was for my old age. I took one consulting contract after retirement and then another. And when the dust settled, I bought Rosehall through Mercer Heritage Holdings, the small family company my accountant had once set up for us so Eleanor could stop pretending she understood filing structures better than I did. I spent just over $1,120,000 restoring the place over 2 years. New slate where slate belonged. Lime plaster instead of the easy garbage. Custom millwork where original trim had been stolen or rotted. Proper drainage behind the orchard wall. Restored leaded glass in the conservatory. The floors in the East Hall lifted, relayed, and finished in hand-rubbed wax because polyurethane would have made Eleanor come back simply to haunt me. Every room had a reason. The blue morning room because Vanessa loved cool light when she worked on pallets. The wide threshold between the kitchen and service corridor because Olive had been born early and I had spent too many nights imagining wheels, braces, and future versions of mobility no house should ever punish. The music room because Eleanor had played the piano badly and joyfully and believed every family needed one room grand enough to feel slightly overdressed in. And the ballroom because Vanessa had once said, half joking, that if she ever ran her own events business, she wanted a place where women could cry at their weddings and still look expensive. When restoration was complete, I did not simply hand Rosehall over. I am not reckless by nature. I kept title through Mercer Heritage Holdings and licensed the events business to Vanessa's company, Rosehall Gatherings, which she owned on paper with Dean as operations director. The house itself, the land, the orchard wall, the conservatory, the principal contents, all remained under my ownership. At the time that felt cautious. It was cautious compared with doing nothing. It was not cautious enough compared with what followed. For the first 18 months, Rosehall was exactly what I had hoped it would be. Vanessa thrived there. You could see it physically. Her shoulders settled lower. Her laugh came back quicker. She moved through the house with the sort of intimate purpose I had wanted for her all along, arm full of linens, voice on the phone, one shoe half on as she raced from the terrace to the tasting room because a florist had changed her mind about ranunculus. She had always been talented, but Rosehall made that talent visible. Brides came. Magazine features followed. A local charity booked the conservatory for a spring luncheon. Then a publisher booked the library for a photo shoot. Then a pair of sisters from Atlanta rented the full estate for a wedding weekend and cried when they saw the orchard lit with paper lanterns. It worked. On Saturday mornings I drove out early with pastries or fresh apricot jam or whatever I had overcommit to making the night before. Olive would hear my car on the gravel before I had fully parked and come running down the front steps with both hands already out as if I owed her a lift into the air simply for arriving. The kitchen would smell like coffee and rosemary biscuits. Vanessa would already be dressed, hair clipped up, list in hand. Dean would be somewhere nearby resetting chairs or talking to the grounds crew or looking handsome in a linen shirt while doing something minor enough that everyone would assume he was doing everything. That last part matters. Dean was very good at looking essential. He had built a respectable career in boutique hospitality before Rosehall. Not empire-level money. Not jets and villas and men who send wine to hotel rooms in apology for numbers with too many zeros. But enough to speak easily about occupancy rates, guest funnels, supplier relationships, brand perception, and margin compression. He knew how to stand in a room and say practical sounding things in a voice pitched exactly between confidence and concern. He was handsome in the kind of way that ages well on first impression. Excellent shoulders. Easy smile. Expensive watches worn as if he had forgotten they were expensive. In the early years of his marriage to Vanessa, I mistook his polish for steadiness. And to be fair, there were real seasons when he was steady. He could load a van. He could charm a mother of the bride. He remembered names, sent flowers when people were ill, and once drove 2 hours at midnight to bring Olive the stuffed rabbit she had left at Rosehall because she would not sleep without it. The world is difficult precisely because truly dangerous people are almost never monstrous all the time. If they were, no one would let them in. The first time Dean borrowed money from me, it was not dramatic. He called on a Monday afternoon in late autumn and said one of his hospitality investments had locked up cash longer than expected. He needed $80,000 for no more than 3 weeks, so payroll at a hotel concept in Charlottesville would not bounce at the wrong moment. He sounded embarrassed but not panicked. Temporary. Administrative. He paid it back on time. That is how those stories begin. The second time it was $120,000 and the explanation involved a vendor dispute, a delayed investor draw, and a contract close enough to complete that asking too many questions would have made me feel both rude and theatrical. He paid back part of it, then refinanced another obligation, then stopped using the language of repayment altogether and moved into that soft family territory where everyone is meant to remember generosity but no one is meant to keep ledgers. I kept ledgers anyway. Museum work teaches you that sentiment is not a filing system. By the time Rosehall was thriving, Dean owed me $176,000 across 3 separate transfers. Not enough to ruin me. More than enough to teach me what his private math looked like when he believed affection could cushion consequence. I said nothing for longer than I should have because Vanessa was busy and Olive was growing and the house was full on weekends and I was tired of being the only person at any family table who remembered what things cost. Then Dean's outside ventures began to fail in earnest. A boutique bar partnership went under after 8 months. A hospitality consultancy thinned to almost nothing when the market cooled. He dressed it in terms like sector contraction and repositioning, but the truth was simpler. Dean lived as if every good year would repeat itself on command. When it didn't, he reached for the nearest solid thing and called that strategy. Rosehall was the nearest solid thing. The first sign was not the orange tags in the music room. That was merely the moment the lie showed its face. The first sign came 4 months earlier when Dean stood on the south terrace with a tumbler of sparkling water and asked me, in the easy tone of a man making conversation, what I thought Rosehall would fetch if one day someone were foolish enough to sell the property and strip the principal contents separately. Strip. That was his word. Not sell furnished. Not market the estate as appointed. Strip the principal contents separately. People reveal themselves by the verbs they choose. I looked at him then, at the way the late light was touching his cuff, the way he was pretending to watch Vanessa direct a ceremony setup while actually waiting for my answer, and I said the house was not for sale and never would be if I could help it. Dean smiled and lifted one shoulder. Of course not, Walter. I only meant theoretically. I have spent too much of my life around appraisal language to believe in theory when money is in the room. After that came smaller things. An email Vanessa forwarded by mistake asking whether all principal rooms had been remeasured for insurance replacement value. A question from Dean about whether my old accession spreadsheets for the antique furnishings still existed and, if so, whether they were digital. A weekend when the silver from the blue dining room sideboard had been moved into storage without anyone warning me first because, as Vanessa put it, a toddler from one wedding nearly pulled down a tray. Then came the conversation about strategic partners. Dean approached that one with care, which told me he knew it mattered. He waited until late October when the event season had thinned and the house was quiet enough for his words to carry. We were in the glass conservatory. Rain on the panes. Olive upstairs with colored pencils. Vanessa in the office answering emails. Dean stood with one hand on the back of a wicker chair and told me Rosehall could grow faster with outside capital. Not ownership, he said quickly. Never ownership. Just operational support. Marketing muscle. Regional expansion. Somebody who could help them brand the place properly, add high-end retreats, culinary weekends, corporate buyouts, the sort of programming that would move Rosehall from beloved local venue to destination property. Destination property. Every time Dean wanted to make greed sound visionary, he dressed it as scale. I asked him what exactly outside capital expected in return. He said the usual things. Minor governance input. Revenue participation. Preferred recovery rights on capital contributions. I asked him to translate that into English. He smiled. A seat at the table, Walter. No, I said. Not with this house. He took the refusal lightly enough that a careless person might have missed the way his jaw tightened just once before loosening again. That was Dean's gift. He could hide offense inside charm so neatly that you walked away feeling you had imagined your own discomfort. 3 weeks later, I arrived at Rosehall just after 10 in the morning and found 2 women from Larch and Wren Estate Services in the music room with orange inventory tags and a third stranger kneeling by Eleanor's piano. That was the morning I told you about at the beginning. I came through the front doors fast enough that one of the women startled and dropped her clipboard against her thigh. She recovered beautifully, which meant she was used to being caught in places before explanations were prepared. Can I help you? She said. I looked at the tag tied to Eleanor's escritoire. Lot preparation code. Temporary removal notation. Condition photo reference on the lower corner. No, I said. But I can help you. You can start by telling me who authorized tags inside my house. Dean finally emerged from behind the curtain. Walter, he said, too quickly, as if my name were a lid he could still put on the room. I was just coming to find you. That was a lie, and not a good one. The women from Larch and Wren looked relieved to see a man enter. People like that always do. They rely on the oldest reflex in the world, which is that a situation becomes administratively cleaner once a male voice arrives and says it is fine. Insurance renewal, Dean said. We have to update the content schedule before the spring calendar opens. I thought Vanessa mentioned it. Vanessa had mentioned no such thing. And those were not insurance tags. Anyone who has cataloged collections for 3 decades knows the difference between a coverage survey and an auction intake system. Insurance appraisers document. They do not group. Auction preparers group everything. They think in lots, room flow, removal sequence, what can travel together, what photographs well, what premium bidders like to see near what. I walked past Dean and untied the orange tag from Eleanor's desk. You can renew insurance without stringing lot codes onto a 19th century writing desk, I said. The woman nearest me opened her mouth, closed it again, then said they had only been told to do a preliminary room-by-room valuation pass. By who? I asked. Dean answered for her. By me. On Vanessa's behalf. It's standard. Nothing is standard when people start using the word preliminary in my house, I said. Take every tag off. Now. Dean looked at me long enough for the room to feel smaller. Walter, you're overreacting. No, I said. You are underexplaining. Those women were gone within 15 minutes. I stood in the gravel drive and watched the Larch and Wren van pull out past the stone pillars Eleanor and I had saved from the original front wall. Dean remained on the steps with one hand tucked into his coat pocket and that infuriating expression on his face, the one that suggested I had made things awkward rather than important. Vanessa came out only after the van disappeared. That told me nearly as much as the tags had. She had known enough to stay out of the room until she could see which way the weather was moving. Her hair was clipped up. She still held her phone. She looked tired in the careful polished way women look when they have not slept enough but are too proud to admit they might be in over their heads. I asked her whether she had authorized an inventory team inside the music room. She said it was only a valuation pass. Dean thought the insurer would want updated figures, and anyway some of the pieces might need new appraisals for tax purposes. Tax purposes. That phrase hung there between us like bad perfume. Tax purposes for what? I asked. Vanessa looked at Dean first. If you want to understand a marriage, do not watch how two people kiss. Watch who they look at before answering simple questions. It was just a precaution, she said at last. Against what? She did not answer. Dean did. Against being underprepared. I almost laughed then, not because anything was funny, but because men who are planning theft always describe themselves as prepared. That evening, back in my townhouse, I called Agnes Bell. Agnes had been head conservator at the museum where I spent most of my career. She was 71 now, lived with a black cat and 3 pairs of reading glasses in an apartment above a pharmacy, and could identify 18th century repair wax from across a room. If I trusted anyone alive to tell me what an orange tag meant without moral dramatics, it was Agnes. I described the tags. The string color. The placement. The lower corner notation. The fact that the piano had been photographed at the legs and casters first. Agnes did not say anything for a moment. Then she asked, very quietly, whether there had been condition numbers written in pencil on the back. Yes. Room initials. Yes. And a short letter string separated by a dash. Yes. She exhaled through her nose. Those are liquidation prep tags, Walter. Not museum intake, not insurance renewal. House sale, estate sale, partial deaccession, some flavor of removal. Larch and Wren uses that system when they are mapping extraction order before catalog copy gets written. I knew she would say that. But knowledge is not the same thing as readiness. I did not leap from Agnes's sentence straight into heroic clarity. I spent the next hour doing what men of my generation sometimes do when something vile has entered the house. I made tea badly and pretended it was a task. I lined up the cup perfectly on the saucer. I sat down. I stood up. I opened the sideboard drawer where Eleanor kept batteries and found, absurdly, exactly the size I needed for nothing. Then I opened my old collection's field binder. I had not touched it in months. Inside were examples of transport forms, valuation codes, emergency movement logs, and enough old professional habits to remind me who I had been long before I became anyone's widower or mother of the bride. Auction houses, estate liquidators, and museum movers all pretend their systems are proprietary. They are not. They share a visual grammar because objects must survive travel whether the motive is scholarship or greed. One look at the lower right corner notation on those tags and I knew Agnes was correct. The letters after the dash were room sequencing identifiers. A person in that house was not just considering change. A person in that house had already begun mapping extraction order. The next morning I drove not to Rosehall but to Bellwether House, a small regional auction venue 20 minutes east where an old museum contact of mine now handled appraisal intake. Her name was Corinne Vale. She had catalogued early American furniture for 20 years and had the careful hands of a violin surgeon. I showed her a cropped photograph of the orange tag without context. She studied it for perhaps 5 seconds before saying, "That is Larch and Wren preliminary lot prep, probably high-value estate division or partial asset release." "Where did you get it?" I told her I was not ready to answer that. She respected the boundary, which made me trust her more. Then she said something I had not expected. "Larch and Wren only comes in that early if someone is trying to know what can be monetized fast without catalog essays. Serious houses bring them in after ownership questions are already settled. Desperate houses bring them in before. Desperate houses." I thanked her and drove directly to Rosehall, where I arrived in time to catch Dean in the side garden with the florist from Winchester and a woman I did not know holding a leather portfolio against her chest. They were standing near the old yew hedge discussing sightlines from the ballroom to the terrace. I might have accepted that at face value if the stranger had not said, in a low practical tone, "If the principal pieces are out by February we can open this wall visually and create a cleaner arrival experience." Open this wall visually. The wall in question was the one between the music room and the old card salon. The wall Eleanor had saved during restoration after 2 contractors told us it would be easier to remove. The wall that carried the portrait rail where our family photographs hung every Christmas. Dean saw me before the others did. He changed expression so quickly that had I not been looking for it, I might have admired the technique. He introduced the stranger as a hospitality consultant named Celeste who was helping them think about future event flow. Celeste smiled and shook my hand as if she had not just discussed my walls like a woman pricing drapery rod length. "Future event flow," I repeated. Dean said he wanted Rosehall to stay competitive. That word again. As if old houses were swimmers in adjacent lanes. The house itself began giving evidence too. Old houses always do. They remember disturbance in physical ways. Drawer contents shifted. A stack of Eleanor's sheet music I knew by weight alone had been moved from the library cabinet to the back office. The silver key to the East Hall vitrine, which I had kept on the second hook inside the pantry door since restoration, had migrated to Dean's desk drawer. When I asked why, Vanessa said staff had been reorganizing access. Staff had not. Staff rarely reorganizes key systems on its own initiative because staff prefers survival. Then came the portrait. Eleanor had one formal portrait, painted years before I met her when her hair was darker and her expression had not yet learned marriage. We hung it in the front hall anyway because Olive liked telling guests she knew the woman in the painting personally. One rainy afternoon I arrived to find the portrait leaning against the wall and the service corridor wrapped at the corners in foam. Dean told me the frame was being inspected for insect activity. I asked which conservator had recommended that. He said he was waiting on a name from a contact. I said the frame went back on the wall before dinner or the contact could inspect his own teeth next. He laughed then, but it was thin. Thin enough to ring. I put the portrait back myself. That night I started sleeping with a legal pad on my bedside table. Every odd phrase. Every moved object. Every stray invoice. Every mention of timelines, consultants, restructuring, brand refresh, founder suite, retention fee. I wrote all of it down because the mind under pressure smooths things it later needs sharp. I had learned that first from collection disasters and then from grief. If you do not write a room when you still have the room, somebody else will later rewrite it for you. Julian called 2 days after the first money trace and asked whether Rosehall gatherings used a separate merchant processor for off-site events. It had, briefly, during the prior winter. He had located several deposits from destination weddings that touched the main operating account only in summary. The actual funds had landed first in a merchant reserve account tied to Dean and then, in neat slices, moved into Halstead Hospitality Advisory. From there some money paid vendor balances. Some did not. Some disappeared into debt service. Some helped keep Rosehall looking solvent long enough to impress people booking the next season. That is the thing about elegant fraud. It often uses enough legitimate payment to remain socially breathable. Nobody notices missing oxygen until the room goes blue. I asked Julian whether Vanessa must have seen it. He said not necessarily. People sign summaries every day without reading down to account origin if someone they trust has already framed the story for them. Then he added, with the gentle cruelty of honest men, but if she did not see it, Walter, that means she preferred not to look. I already knew that. It still helped to hear someone else say it. The tack room scene you heard about earlier happened the same week. What I did not tell you yet was what I found on the second shelf behind the crates. Dean had tucked 3 rolls of printed labels there, each one cut for discreet adhesion to wood or frame backing. Marigold inventory. Holding room. Release pending. Those were the exact words. Not a question of whether the objects might move. A system for where they would wait until the house changed hands enough to pretend the movement had always been inevitable. I took 1 roll and left the other 2. Evidence is most useful when the thief has not yet realized it is missing. The following Sunday, while Olive was at a choir practice and Vanessa was upstairs steaming napkins because she had inherited my least profitable forms of discipline, Dean asked me whether I still kept digital scans of my old accession records off-site. He framed it as disaster planning. Rosehall needed a fuller archive, he said, in case anything ever happened to the house. I told him yes, I did keep scans. He asked where. I told him somewhere sensible and watched the disappointment move through his face like a shadow crossing shallow water. That was when I understood he wanted provenance not to protect the objects but to exploit confusion about them. If he could place enough paperwork in his own hands, he could later speak about selected contents with authority even if he did not own them. Men like Dean do not always steal the object first. Sometimes they steal the confidence with which others describe the object. That realization made me faster. Still, hearing it out loud rearranged the evening. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at the yellow roses dying slowly in the bowl by the window and understood, with that cold adult clarity that does not ask permission from the heart, that Dean had moved past theory. He was not thinking about future options. He was preparing my house to come apart. The next morning I drove back to Rosehall earlier than usual and let myself in through the staff entrance. I was not sneaking. I had keys to every exterior lock and legal title to the walls. But I moved quietly enough that the kitchen staff did not hear me until I was in the corridor outside the office. Dean's printer had always been a careless machine. It grabbed 2 sheets when it wanted one and left the top page in the output tray half the time because he never bothered to service it. That morning it gave me the first real document I could hold. A single page lay face down in the tray. The heading at the top read Marigold House Capital, Confidential Working Terms. Halfway down the page, under Acquisition Outline, were the words I felt all the way into my jaw. Phase 1, Contents Rationalization and Removal. Phase 2, Operational Reset under New Hospitality Identity. Phase 3, Principal Residence Conversion. I picked up the sheet and kept reading. Projected purchase price for Rosehall, inclusive of business goodwill. And selected non-integral contents, $3,800,000. $3,800,000. That was not market value. That was distress price. Forced price. Hurry now, regret later price. And there, 2 lines lower, under strategic retention incentives, sat the numbers Dean had not intended me to see. Managing transition fee to D. Halstead, $425,000. Advisory retention payment to V. Halstead, $110,000. So there it was. Not theory. Not tax planning. Not operational support. A carve-out. A payout. My daughter had a price on the page. I folded the sheet once and put it in my bag. Then I stood very still in that office and looked around properly for the first time. Dean's laptop was closed. His leather folio sat on the chair. A stack of vendor invoices leaned against the desk lamp. Several were stamped final notice. 1 linen supplier. 1 florist. 1 catering balance from a wedding in September. 1 heating contractor for the ballroom boilers. Rosehall gatherings had been taking deposits and failing to pay people on the back end. That, at least, explained the hurry. When I drove home, I did not go straight to my kitchen. I went to Julian Pike's office downtown. Julian was the son of one of Eleanor's oldest friends and one of the few forensic accountants I know who can make a spreadsheet sound like a confession. He was 45, careful, married to a pediatrician, and had inherited his father's habit of removing his glasses whenever the room got interesting. I trusted him because he did not flatter and because he loved facts more than drama. I told him I needed discretion and speed. He said those were usually expensive words. I told him I was willing to pay for both. By evening I had given Julian every account statement, every transfer record, every invoice Vanessa had ever casually forwarded me for reimbursement, and the 1 page from Marigold House Capital. He looked at it once, then looked at me. "Do you want the polite version or the useful one?" he asked. Useful. Someone is trying to convert a stable family asset into emergency liquidity before other obligations catch up with them. I sat back. What obligations? I don't know yet, Julian said. But nobody takes an $8.6 million estate and tries to move it at 3.8 unless there is a fire somewhere else. That line stayed with me. Because once he said fire, I could suddenly smell smoke in every room Dean had touched. The next week gave me more pieces than I wanted and fewer than I needed. Housekeeper gossip is often dismissed by people who mistake class for accuracy. I have never made that error. Women who fold your linens and polish your silver usually know exactly when a household has started lying. Marta Ruiz had worked weekends at Rosehall since the first gala we hosted after restoration. She came from a family of florists, moved like quiet wind, and missed nothing human. On Thursday afternoon she asked whether I had authorized the packing crates in the carriage house. I asked what packing crates. She said 2 had arrived late Tuesday, unmarked except for fragile tape and a shipping label strip with the name L&W Logistics. Dean told the delivery driver to put them in the old tack room and shut the inner door. Marta only knew because she had been stripping linens in the upstairs blue room and watched them through the side window. L&W, Larch and Wren again. I drove out that night after dusk, parked behind the orchard wall, and let myself in through the side garden gate. I did not go to the carriage house immediately. I stood behind the stone urns along the terrace and watched the back of the main house the way one watches a stage before a bad scene begins. At 8:40, Dean crossed the service yard with a flashlight and a ring of keys. He let himself into the tack room, stayed less than 3 minutes, and came back out carrying Eleanor's bronze desk lamp from the downstairs library wrapped in a moving blanket. He did not take it far. He set it in the back of his SUV. I remember that more vividly than perhaps I should. Not because the lamp was the most valuable object in the house. It wasn't. But Eleanor bought that lamp the year Vanessa was born because she said no family should raise a child in ugly light if they could possibly help it. I had read bedtime stories under that lamp. Vanessa had done her college applications under that lamp. Olive once hid jelly beans in its drawer because she thought adults never checked those. And their dean was moving it like surplus. That was the moment I stopped thinking in terms of prevention and started thinking in terms of consequence. I did not confront him there in the yard. There are times to strike and times to inventory. That night I needed inventory. The tack room held 3 crates, not 2. The labels had been peeled, but the corner markings remained. Lot preparation foam. Interior blocking. Custom cavity cutouts. One crate already held the lamp and 2 porcelain figurines from the morning room wrapped in tissue that did not belong to Rosehall. I photographed everything. Then I put every piece back exactly as I had found it and drove home with both hands tight on the wheel and enough anger in me to feel metallic. 2 days later Julian called. He had spent 48 hours doing what he did best, which was following money until it stopped pretending to be innocent. Rosehall gatherings had been receiving event deposits properly for the first year. Then patterns changed. Certain deposits began landing in an auxiliary account tied to Halstead Hospitality Advisory, one of Dean's dormant companies. Vendor payments slowed while cash advances to that advisory company rose. Several transfers then moved from Halstead Hospitality Advisory into a private debt management firm in Baltimore and one into Marigold House Capital itself. When Julian said that, I sat down. He repeated it. Dean had already been paying Marigold House Capital before Rosehall was ever pitched as a solution. Meaning Marigold was not a new strategic partner. Marigold was the creditor. Or one of them. Julian had also found court filings. 2 civil complaints against entities Dean controlled. 1 unresolved guarantee demand. 1 confidential settlement likely tied to a failed lease but not yet public. Total exposure, conservatively, just over $780,000. There was Dean's fire. And he meant to put it out with my house. I drove to Rosehall that same afternoon and asked Vanessa to walk with me in the lower orchard because I did not want walls helping either of us lie. The trees were bare by then. Late November. Thin sun. The old brick wall along the east edge throwing a striped shadow across the grass. Olive was inside practicing for a school choral recital she had already described as mostly standing with extra instructions. I brought the Marigold page. I brought copies of the transfer summary Julian prepared. I brought 1 photograph of the crate in the tack room with Eleanor's lamp inside. Vanessa looked at the first page and blanched. Then she looked at the second and went hard in the face the way people do when fear makes them reach for anger because anger feels more active. You went through our office, she said. Not the point. You hired someone to look at our accounts. Yes. You had no right. I stopped walking. No right, I said, while your husband packs my dead wife's lamp into a crate and arranges a distress sale on a house I still legally own. She opened her mouth, closed it, then said the sentence that changed everything between us. You still legally own everything. That is the problem. The cold that went through me then had nothing to do with weather. Vanessa took a breath and kept going. Not because she wanted to hurt me, I think, but because she had been waiting too long to say ugly things and the file in her hands had removed her last excuse. You built Rosehall for me, she said, and then you never stopped treating it like it was still yours in every way that mattered. Your furniture. Your rules. Your mother's. Silver in the dining room. Dad's records in the music room. Every big decision still had to pass through your feelings first. Do you know what it is like to run a business inside someone else's memorial? I stood there and let her speak because interrupting would only have protected me from hearing the full size of it. Dean was trying to save the place, she said. We fell behind after last winter. 2 cancellations, the boiler, the tent supplier dispute, the property taxes, your refusal to bring in outside equity. We needed options. We still need options. By stripping the house for parts. No. The lie came too fast. Then what are the crates for? She looked away. And in that silence I understood something worse than embezzlement. Vanessa already knew. Not every detail perhaps. Not the exact payout figures. But enough. Enough to look at orange tags and call them strategy. Enough to let Dean place value next to history and still sleep under the same roof as her child. I handed her the photograph of Eleanor's lamp. She stared at it. Then she said quietly, "Dean told me those were temporary holds. Pieces we might move into climate storage if the partnership required renovations." Partnership. There is no moral rot in the world that cannot be made tidier by giving it a neutral noun. I asked her whether she knew Marigold House Capital was already receiving Dean's money. She said nothing. I asked whether she understood that the price on that sheet was barely half what Rosehall could command if marketed honestly. Nothing. I asked whether she knew he stood to receive $425,000 personally if the sale closed. That got her. Her head snapped toward me, and for 1 second the wife vanished and my daughter looked out from under the life she had chosen. What? I held the page out again and pointed. She read it twice. Then a third time. And even then, even standing in the bare orchard with truth in her hand, Vanessa did not do what a wife should do when she realizes her husband has priced both her father and her home. She asked whether I was sure the page was final. That was when I knew how deep Dean's voice had gotten into her. When people are ready to leave a lie, they do not ask whether the evidence might be a draft. They ask how quickly they can stop the damage. I left her there in the orchard and drove straight to Ellen Rourke. Ellen was my estate attorney, 58, precise, red-haired, and incapable of wasting a sentence on false comfort. She looked through the pages, listened to my outline, and began tapping a pen against her desk in sets of 3, which I had learned meant she was already building response paths. "We had several choices," she said. "Some clean, some ugly. Clean is trust transfer plus immediate notice of revoked operational authority if misuse is proved. Ugly is injunction, fraud referral, emergency protective filing, and a public fight. Which protects the house fastest?" "The ugly one," she said. "The clean one protects the house permanently if we get there before they shift the asset. But if they are already moving contents and trying to close financing against apparent authority, speed matters more than elegance." I asked what I should have done at the beginning. She said you should have put Rosehall into an irrevocable family trust the day the plaster dried. But that answer costs us nothing now, so I will not bill you for regret. That is why I keep Ellen. By the time I left her office, we had the bones of a plan. Mercer Rosehall Trust would be executed immediately. Title to the real property and all documented principal contents would move into the trust with me as lifetime trustee and Olive as ultimate beneficiary, Vanessa holding conditional beneficial rights only if no attempt to encumber or liquidate the estate occurred outside trust terms. It was not just protection. It was structure with teeth. At the same time Ellen prepared a notice of material breach against Rosehall gatherings based on unauthorized inventorying, attempted transfer preparations, and probable commingling of company funds. We could serve it at once and trigger war. Or, Ellen said, we could wait. Why wait? Because men like Dean tell the truth fastest when they think victory is one signature away. That was the sentence that began the revenge. Up to that point I had been defending. After that, I started designing. There is an old saying in collections work. If you cannot catch the thief at the cabinet, catch the lie at the catalog. Objects move through paper before they move through doors. Dean had already told me how he wanted the room staged. Strategic partner. Operational reset. Necessary liquidity. Preservation through change. He needed me to play grieving benefactor one last time and lend my name to the theft so everyone else in the county would call it visionary. So I decided to let him think he might still have me. 3 mornings later I arrived at Rosehall with lemon cakes from the bakery in town and the expression of a man who had spent a sleepless weekend doing reluctant arithmetic. It did not take much acting. Some seasons of your life are so ugly you can borrow the truth to lie with it. Dean met me in the hall outside the office and watched me carefully. He had not yet recovered from the orchard conversation because Vanessa had almost certainly confronted him, but his talent for recovery had always been strongest where money was concerned. I told him I wanted to see everything. Every proposal. Every term sheet. Every partnership document. Every projected revenue model. If he wished me to consider a structural solution for Rosehall, I would not do it on abstractions. Dean looked surprised first, then relieved in a way he could not quite hide. Of course, Walter, he said. I wanted transparency from the beginning. No, I thought. You wanted access. But I only smiled, as if we were two adults finally choosing collaboration over misunderstanding. Within an hour I had everything I needed. Not because Dean was stupid. Because greed makes smart men prematurely generous. He walked me through a full presentation in the ballroom using printed slides. Marigold House would acquire a controlling interest in Rosehall operations through a layered structure that began as rescue capital and ended in practical control of the estate. The house itself would be repositioned as an exclusive residency and wellness retreat under a new identity. Several rooms would be modernized. The Blue Morning Room would become a member lounge. The library would become a tasting salon. The music room, my favorite room in the house, would become what Dean called a flexible private dining environment. Flexible. There are words that should be illegal near Old Wood. When I asked what happened to the principal contents, Dean flipped to a slide titled Curatorial Streamlining. My wife should have risen from the dead just to spit on the projector. Curatorial streamlining meant selected antiques sold, others warehoused, certain family items returned to me or to Vanessa depending on sentimental priority, anything deemed visually inconsistent with the new identity removed. I asked who determined sentimental priority. Dean did not answer immediately. Then he said the transition committee would. And who is the transition committee? A slight pause. Myself, Vanessa, and Marigold's asset lead. There it was. The people who wanted the money would determine the meaning of the objects. That afternoon I took Olive into town for hot chocolate and asked, as casually as one can ask a child anything serious, whether she had noticed changes at Rosehall she thought were strange. She stirred whipped cream into her cocoa until it disappeared, considered the question properly, and said Daddy had started calling the music room the Red Room because the chairs were too old to match the future. Then she said the upstairs blue bedroom had been measured twice by a woman with a silver ponytail and Daddy told her not to worry because everybody sleeps somewhere when houses become businesses again. Everybody sleeps somewhere when houses become businesses again. That is not the sort of sentence a 9-year-old invents. I asked if anybody had talked about moving. Olive shrugged in the tragic way children do when they are trying to act older than their fear. Daddy said if we had to live in the city for a while there would be better schools and we could come back when Rosehall was fixed. Come back. The house was already fixed. I had spent $1,120,000 and 2 winters proving it. That evening I went through every restoration invoice I still had, every accession sheet Agnes and I built for principal furnishings, every insurance rider, every photograph from the final restoration survey. Then Agnes came over with her cat hair coat and a magnifying visor hanging from her neck like war equipment. We spread the records across my dining table and began matching them to the pieces Dean had tagged or crated. By midnight we had built the second half of my trap. Rosehall's most valuable objects were not business furnishings at all. They were personal property documented under my name with restoration provenance, appraisal schedules, and donor chain histories too strong to dispute. Eleanor's piano. The escritoire. The bronze lamp. 6 paintings. The blue dining room silver. The marble console from the East Hall. The pair of carved walnut chairs in the music room. The conservatory urns. If Dean wanted to sell them, he would have to lie in writing about ownership. If Marigold House had already modeled profit from those items, then Marigold was either misled or complicit. I was beginning not to care which. Julian delivered the next gift. He found an internal debt schedule Dean never meant outsiders to see. It sat tucked inside a scanned packet forwarded to a debt management firm and then stored in a cloud archive Dean believed had been deleted. Julian has a way with deleted things. The schedule listed immediate obligations if Rosehall remained unsold after January. Investor call note. Catering lawsuit reserve. Personal line maturity. Litigation exposure if Marigold offer collapsed. Total short-term desperation, $1,043,000. There it was. The real number. Not Vanessa's business strain. Not taxes. Not boiler repair. Dean's fire had become an inferno, and he was prepared to pour Rosehall straight into it. When people ask me now when the story stopped feeling like suspicion and started feeling like war, I tell them it was the moment I saw his desperation fully itemized. Nothing clarifies evil like a spreadsheet. A week before Christmas, Dean made his move. He asked me to dinner in the library. Just family, he said. Vanessa made roast chicken. Olive was allowed 1 glass of sparkling cider in an etched coupe because she believed stemware improved both taste and authority. The room looked beautiful. Candlelight on the book spines. Winter branches in the mantel jars. Eleanor's portrait watching all of us from over the fireplace with the same kind patient face that had once made me believe love could civilize ambition. Halfway through dinner Dean raised his glass and thanked me for building a future large enough for all of them to grow inside. I already disliked the sentence. Then he said Rosehall had reached an inflection point and families who survive for generations are the ones who know when emotion must yield to structure. That was his cue. Vanessa put down her fork without looking at me. Dean slid a navy folder across the table. Inside lay a signature packet for what he called a transitional stewardship arrangement. It was not the sale itself. Dean knew better than to show the blade before the throat was still. It was a precursor, a document granting Rosehall Gatherings broader authority to negotiate partnership terms, move selected contents for valuation, and make interim operational decisions on behalf of Mercer Heritage Holdings subject to good faith consultation. Good faith consultation. There should be a museum of criminal euphemism somewhere. Dean would deserve a donor wall. He had even left sticky tabs where he wanted initials. I read the packet very slowly while they watched me. Olive, mercifully, was more interested in the way her candlelight reflected in the glass than in the future of the estate. She was humming to herself under her breath, rearranging roast carrots into an arch, and still close enough to innocence that the room had not yet fully darkened around her. When I finished, I closed the folder and said I would not sign anything over dinner like a man ordering dessert. Dean smiled and said he admired that. Then, softer, he said time mattered. There was a note of strain under his charm now. The kind desperate men mistake for urgency. I asked how much time. By New Year's, he said. Which meant sooner. Because all deadlines with predators are padded for manipulation. I told him I wanted a full public presentation. If Rosehall was truly at an inflection point, then I would not shuffle documents in a side room like a confused widower. I wanted a proper gathering in the ballroom after Christmas with the major vendors, key donors, preservation supporters, and anyone else who had a legitimate stake in Rosehall's future. Dean looked startled. Vanessa looked wary. I pressed on. If you want me to bless structural change, I said, then you will not get it in secret. You will show me, and everyone else, exactly how this house is supposedly being saved. That was the bait. Dean bit so fast I almost pitied him. Almost. He agreed within the minute and suggested the 12th night benefactors dinner already on the calendar as the ideal moment. We could fold the announcement into the evening, he said. Celebrate Rosehall's next chapter. Honor Eleanor's vision. Thank supporters for carrying the estate into a new era. I remember the exact phrase. A new era. Men with debt always talk like emperors when they think someone else is about to pay for the empire. I have thought often since then about how much of revenge is paperwork and how much is theater. The honest answer is that the good kind requires both. Paper keeps the house. Theater keeps the memory of what was attempted from being rewritten later by smoother mouths. The first part happened in Ellen's office under ordinary fluorescent light. I signed trust schedules, contents appendices, and beneficiary conditions while she clicked each tab into order and asked me, 3 separate times, whether I understood that once Mercer Rosehall Trust was executed I could not casually unwind it later just because family feelings improved in spring. I told her that was precisely why I wanted it. Protection is most useful when it survives reconciliation. The second part happened in my dining room after midnight with Agnes, Julian, and a stack of folders high enough to make the room look temporarily bureaucratic. We built what Agnes called the provenance wall. Every principal object Dean had tagged or discussed moving got its own sheet. Photograph, appraisal value, ownership chain, restoration reference, current room location, any distinctive damage mark that proved continuity. By 2 in the morning the dining room looked less like a widower's home and more like the war room for an especially elegant siege. I loved it. Agnes loved it more. She gets younger around organized outrage. Julian handled the financial wall. Deposits. Diversions. Creditor pressure. Marigold transfers. Larch and Wren timing. We were not just preparing to prove theft. We were preparing to prove sequence. Sequence matters. If a man claims he only sought rescue capital after a business crisis deepened, but his inventory tags predate the crisis language he later used publicly, then he is not reacting. He is planning. Meanwhile Rosehall itself was being staged for 12th night in ways that would have been almost funny if the stakes were smaller. Dean wanted cream silk runners on the ballroom tables, not the moss velvet Vanessa preferred, because cream photographed as legacy while green photographed as wedding. He insisted on extra uplighting near the musicians' gallery because, in his words, major transition moments should never happen in timid light. Vanessa snapped at. 2 florists, cried once in the pastry room when she thought no one saw, then came out with fresh lipstick as if grief could be powdered into discretion. I watched all of it with the strange detachment of a man attending his own attempted burial and taking notes on the linens. A rumor began circulating 3 days before the dinner that I was finally stepping back from active involvement at Rosehall. Not retiring exactly. Transitioning. That word again. Lorraine had not yet been hired, so Dean and Vanessa still controlled staff messaging. One of the servers asked Marta whether I was moving south to be closer to old friends. A floral assistant wanted to know whether the trust benefiting Rosehall would now become a donor board. Someone in the kitchen said Mr. Halstead had told a rental vendor we were entering a new ownership era. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you are watching from. It helps this story reach more people who understand how family, money, and trust can become dangerous when the wrong person gets too close. That was useful, too. Because by the time we opened the ballroom doors, Dean had already hung himself in conversation often enough that any sudden public correction would feel like revelation rather than misunderstanding. I did one more thing before the dinner, and this part matters more than the law because it concerns the cost of telling a child the truth. On the afternoon before 12th night, I took Olive out to the old greenhouse bench where the citron tree lives in winter and asked her whether anything in the house had been making her uneasy. I did not want details for strategy. I wanted to know the weather inside her. She thought about it in the solemn exact way children sometimes do when adults finally ask the right question. Then she said she did not like that Daddy had started calling the front hall a lobby and the upstairs blue room inventory. She said rooms should not be called inventory because inventory sounded like you did not have to love it before moving it. Children will put a knife into the center of a thing without ever knowing they are armed. I asked whether she felt frightened. She said not frightened exactly. Just as if everyone was talking around a secret and she kept bumping into the corners of it. So I told her something plain. I said grown people sometimes make money problems sound like house problems because house problems sound more noble. I said none of the rooms in Rosehall were going anywhere that week. I said if anything confusing happened at the dinner, Agnes would take her to the greenhouse cottage and stay with her as long as needed. Olive nodded. Then she asked whether Daddy had done something bad or just something expensive. I laughed then, despite myself, because it was such a Mercer distinction. I told her sometimes those turn out to be the same thing. That evening Vanessa knocked on my door in the west corridor just after 11. The house was finally quiet. Staff gone. Candles snuffed. Cold settling at the windows. She stood there in a robe with her makeup half removed and looked older than 41, not by age exactly, but by accumulation. "I think he loves me," she said by way of greeting. I did not invite her in immediately because some sentences deserved to stand in the hallway a moment. Then I stepped aside. She sat on the chair by the fire and held her own elbows like a girl waiting for a verdict. She said Dean loved her, had loved her, but that love became harder to identify whenever bills arrived. She said she knew he had crossed lines. She said she had not known how far. She said he kept telling her that if the deal went through quickly enough all the damage would become temporary and no one outside the family would ever need to know. There is no phrase in the English language more dangerous inside a family than "no one needs to know." I asked her why she came to me that night. "Because if I asked you not to do tomorrow," she said, "you would ask whether I was asking as your daughter or as his wife. And I don't think I know anymore." That hurt because it was true. I told her tomorrow would happen. Not because I wanted to punish her in public, though I will not lie and say that was no part of me. It would happen because Dean had already built a public story around my consent, and because once a lie like that enters a room full of donors and officials, silence becomes collaboration. I told her she still had one decision left. She could either sit beside him and let the room teach her who he was, or she could excuse herself before dinner and speak to Ellen privately. Vanessa asked what Ellen would tell her. I said Ellen would tell her exactly how much of a future remained available to a woman who had allowed herself to be written into the price. She cried then. Quietly. Not as absolution. Just because tears had become the only honest language left for an hour. In the end she said she would stay for dinner. I think some part of her still wanted to see whether Dean could somehow improvise a version of innocence so dazzling that all the documents in my study would turn back into paper. Love makes magicians of mediocre men all the time. When she left my room, I stood at the window and looked over the frozen terrace toward the dark outline of the carriage house. The room behind me held the trust draft, the ownership ledgers, the debt schedules, the photographs of crates and tags. The room ahead of me held my daughter's marriage and the shell of my grandchild's normal life. Revenge sounds delicious when told properly. It is much less clean at 1 in the morning when the house is asleep and your hands smell faintly of sealing wax from trust envelopes. I slept 2 hours. At 6 I was up in the kitchen helping Marta lay out breakfast because ordinary gestures before catastrophe can steady the body in ways philosophy never will. I buttered toast. I set out marmalade. I watched frost on the conservatory panes thin under first light. Dean came in at 6:40 looking tired and over-caffeinated, kissed my cheek with the confidence of a man who believed the final performance would go his way, and asked whether I had reviewed the speech introduction he placed by my napkin. I told him I had. I had not. I had my own. By noon the trust was filed. By 3 Ellen had confirmed receipt-stamped copies. By 4 Julian had duplicated the slides in 3 separate locations in case Dean got nervous and tried to tamper with the ballroom screen. By 5 Agnes had Olive and the other children happily convinced that the greenhouse cottage was the only place on earth where hot chocolate tasted properly ceremonial. By 7, the candles were lit and the trap was complete. The next 3 weeks were the busiest I had been since Rosehall's restoration. Only now I was not choosing drapery lining or arguing about mortar color. I was building a trap. Ellen executed Mercer Rosehall Trust on an emergency basis with title transfer completed before New Year's. She also filed notices so airtight that any attempted encumbrance or unauthorized sale of principal assets would be dead on arrival. Agnes and I finalized an ownership ledger for every major object Dean had tagged or discussed moving. Julian prepared a concise financial summary showing deposit diversion, hidden liabilities, and marigold transfers in language no jury could possibly misread. Then came the part one enjoyed most. I let Dean believe I was softening. I asked more questions. I requested one or two small revisions to wording. I complimented his presentation deck once, which nearly made him glow. I even let him walk me through the ballroom staging plan for 12th night, all candlelit tables and cream roses and a projection screen under the musicians' gallery. He wanted the announcement made after the second course while everyone was full enough to accept good news and sober enough to sign a guest book they would later remember. He had really thought it through. That pleased me more than it should have. Not because I enjoy humiliation for its own sake. Because a man deserves the full architecture of his failure. When he has mistaken your patience for decline. Dean was not my only problem. Vanessa remained half inside the lie, which made her more dangerous in certain ways than Dean himself. Predators know they are lying. Loved ones know just enough to call truth inconvenient. She spent those weeks moving through Rosehall like a woman choosing between shame and profit and resenting everyone who noticed the indecision. Some days she barely looked at me. Other days she became abruptly attentive, too attentive, offering tea, asking if I was tired, reminding me how much pressure the season had placed on all of them. I recognized the tone. It was not caregiving. It was narrative setup. If I seemed fragile enough in the weeks before 12th night, then Dean's partnership would look less like theft and more like family intervention. One afternoon she asked whether I had considered finally downsizing into one of the new condominiums in town because the stairs in my townhouse were surely becoming inconvenient. I told her my stairs had not yet offended me. She laughed too quickly and said of course not. But there it was. People do not start asking old men where they intend to live next unless they are already making floor plans without them. The middle of January teaches you a great deal about light. It shows every crack. It gives back nothing flattering. That suited me. On the Monday before 12th night, I asked Olive to help me in the small upstairs linen room because I needed ribbon sorted and she believed ribbon was a profession she might enter later. While we worked, she told me the woman with the silver ponytail had come back twice, and once she heard Daddy say the blue room could become a founder suite if the old things were cleared. Founder suite. There are rooms in every family house that contain more than furniture. The blue room at Rosehall held the quilt Eleanor's grandmother stitched during the war, Vanessa's christening gown boxed in tissue, and the cedar chest where I kept letters too personal to leave in the library. Dean had already mentally turned that room into branded lodging. Olive did not know what founder suite meant. She only knew she disliked the way her father said it. I thanked her and tied ribbon into little knots that looked cheerful enough to forgive me for the thoughts in my head. 2 days before the dinner, Marigold House's asset lead came to Rosehall for a final walkthrough. Her name was Simone Acker. Tall, immaculate, pearl gray suit, voice like cooled steel. She shook my hand in the music room and said she had heard so much about the property and hoped, if all went well, that its next chapter would be both profitable and respectful. That sentence told me almost everything. Profitable first. Respectful second. Always the order that matters. I smiled as though we were discussing chrysanthemums. Simone walked through the house with Dean and Vanessa while I remained half a step behind asking occasional innocuous questions. Would the conservatory change? Would the orchard stay public for spring school visits? Would the library still hold Eleanor's first editions? By the time we reached the ballroom, Simone had grown careless enough to answer honestly in outline if not in detail. The conservatory would need a beverage service station and partial climate modification. The orchard would remain open selectively, not publicly. The library would be curated for brand coherence. Curated for brand coherence. I nearly thanked her for giving me such a beautiful phrase to destroy with. When the walkthrough ended, Dean drew me aside and said Simone was impressed by my grace. Apparently not every matriarch adjusted so well when visionary change became necessary. I looked at him then with all the warmth I could produce and told him I had lived long enough to know the difference between clinging and timing. He mistook that for surrender. And that is why the revenge worked. 12th night arrived cold and bright. The sort of clean January evening that makes stone walls look older and lies look sharper. Rosehall had never looked more beautiful. White tapers in the ballroom. The musicians' gallery draped in evergreen and silk ribbon. Eleanor's portrait on an easel in the entry hall with winter hellebores below. Champagne trays moving under chandeliers. I had rewired myself during restoration because the electrician wanted to simplify them, and I do not believe in simplifying old light. The guest list was Dean's pride. Regional investors. Donors. Vendors. The county preservation chair. 3 couples whose weddings had helped put Rosehall on the map. A feature writer from a lifestyle magazine Vanessa had been chasing for months. The bank vice president Dean hoped would later help smooth financing language. And several friends who believed they were attending a celebratory dinner about Rosehall's future. I invited my own guests too. Dean did not notice because he was too busy admiring the room. Ellen Rourke came in black silk with the calm face of a woman who enjoys contracts more than small talk. Julian arrived 10 minutes later pretending to be bored already, which is how he always looks when he is about to ruin someone's week. Agnes came wrapped in charcoal cashmere and carried herself like a retired empress of condition reports. Marta was there, officially because I wanted to honor staff. The county preservation chair brought his deputy. And near the back of the room, seated 2 tables apart and speaking to no one, sat a woman from the state attorney general's financial fraud unit whom Ellen knew from a trust exploitation case 5 years earlier. Dean did not recognize her. That pleased me immensely. Dinner began beautifully. Too beautifully. That is often how betrayals like to dress. The soup course went out. Toasts were made. Vanessa looked radiant in green satin and pearls that had belonged to my mother. I watched that and felt a stab of something so old and paternal that I had to put my wine down. There is no complete victory in a family war. Even when you are right, you still bleed where you love. Dean gave the first speech. He thanked Rosehall's friends for believing in history, in hospitality, and in the power of brave stewardship. He thanked me for creating the foundation on which Vanessa had built something extraordinary. He thanked Eleanor by name. He even had the gall to say some houses are saved not by nostalgia but by courage. Then he lifted a hand toward me. And with the whole room watching, he said that after months of careful conversation, I had agreed to support Rosehall's transition into a larger, stronger future and would be signing the final stewardship documents before the night was over. There it was. The public theft. Not the paper itself. The story around the paper. I heard 3 different people begin applauding before the sound died under its own uncertainty because I had not moved. Vanessa looked at me across the candlelight, and I saw it in her face then. Not triumph. Not exactly. Something more brittle. Hope mixed with dread. She still believed, right up to that second, that if this worked, she would be allowed to keep enough of herself intact to forgive the method. I stood slowly. At my age, when you rise carefully in a ballroom, people assume fragility. That assumption served me beautifully. I thanked Dean for his speech. I thanked the guests for loving Rosehall enough to come out on a bitter January night. I said that houses like this are often described as assets and that while I understand the language of assets perfectly well, I have always believed the more important question is who exactly is calculating value and for whom. Then I asked the technician to advance the first slide. Dean's face changed at once. Because the screen behind me did not show the tasteful title card from his presentation deck. It showed a photograph of Eleanor's bronze desk lamp inside a crate in the tack room under the label L&W interior removal sequence. The room went silent so fast I could hear one spoon touch one plate at the back table. I let the image sit. Then I asked for the next slide. Eleanor's escritoire with orange tag. Next. The Steinway legs being photographed. Next. Marigold House terms sheet with contents rationalization highlighted in gold. By then Dean had already stood up. "Walter," he said sharply, "what is this?" I looked at him and said it was a catalogue. A true one. Then I began. I told the room that Rosehall had indeed reached an inflection point, but not the one Dean described. I told them that over the past months Dean Halstead had diverted event deposits into outside entities under his control, fallen into debt severe enough to invite a distressed acquisition, and attempted to prepare Rosehall's contents for liquidation without the permission of the legal owner of either the house or the objects involved. Murmurs began immediately. Good. I wanted sound in the room. I wanted no one later to remember a smooth evening. Dean interrupted, called the accusations outrageous, said this was a private family matter being distorted by grief and control issues. Vanessa rose too, color high in her face, and told me this was not the time. "No," I said into the microphone. "This is exactly the time. Because theft likes private rooms and emotional fog, and I have decided Rosehall has had enough of both." Then I asked for the next slide. Julian had prepared it. 3 columns. Event deposits received. Vendor payments delayed. Transfers to Halstead Hospitality Advisory and Marigold House Capital. No decorative language. No flourish. Just movement. Numbers will always strip a charming man faster than anger will. Dean tried to laugh it off. He said operational transfers happen in every growth business. Julian stood from the back table and said not usually into a creditor entity preparing to buy the host property at less than half appraised value. That quieted even the donors. Next slide. The internal debt schedule. Immediate obligations if Rosehall remained unsold. Total exposure, $1,043,000. Simone Acker, up to that point so elegant in her pearl gray suit, went absolutely still. Dean turned toward her then, which told me something useful. He had not expected Marigold's side to be publicly lit either. Good. Next slide. Strategic retention incentives. Managing transition fee to D. Halstead, $425,000. Advisory retention payment to V. Halstead, $110,000. This time the sound in the room changed. It ceased being confusion and became disgust. Because donors can forgive bad judgment if the lighting is kind. They cannot forgive line items. Vanessa sat back down very slowly as if her knees had suddenly become administrative rather than human. She stared at the figure beside her own initial and, for one awful second, looked exactly like the little girl who once came home from school clutching a broken clarinet reed and trying not to cry because she had wanted so badly to be good at something immediately. I wish I could tell you that paternal recognition softened me. It did not. Not then. I had seen Eleanor's lamp in a crate. I had heard Olive repeat found her sweet like a child trying on a curse. And my daughter had allowed both. Dean attempted his recovery. He said the numbers were proposed contingencies, not actual payouts. He said the house needed intervention. He said I had romanticized Rosehall beyond operational reality. He said any transfer would have preserved long-term viability and that I was now humiliating my own family before people who did not understand the pressure involved. I let him speak. Then I asked Ellen Rourke to stand. Ellen did, elegant as a blade. She informed the room that title to Rosehall and all documented principal contents had been transferred 3 days earlier into Mercer Rosehall Trust. She stated, in a tone dry enough to preserve parchment, that no partnership, encumbrance, bridge financing, contents movement, or sale could lawfully proceed without trustee authorization, which had not been given and would not be. She further informed everyone that Rosehall gatherings had been served that afternoon with notice of material breach and suspension of operational authority pending full accounting. At that point, had the story been only legal, I might have stopped. But I had promised you a real revenge. And legal suffocation is often too polite for what some people earn. So I asked for the next slide. This one was a screenshot of a text thread Dean never imagined I would get. Julian found it in an account backup tied to the same debt archive that held the liabilities schedule. Dean and Simon Lark, the L in Larch and Wren, discussing removal priorities. The messages were brief, vulgar, and perfectly clear. Get the old man's sentimental favorites out first. Once they are off-site she signs faster. No one touches the piano until after gala. Vanessa only needs enough to believe she still has a role. I heard someone at the center table inhale so hard it sounded like an injury. Vanessa made a small sound then. Not quite a sob. Not yet. Just the sound of a person discovering that betrayal has layers and she was not standing on the top one. Dean turned toward her so quickly that the room watched him do it. That was important. A guilty man can deny a spreadsheet. He cannot hide reflex. Simone Acker stood and said Marigold House had been materially misled if the trust transfer and contents ownership schedules were authentic. Ellen said they were and had certified copies at the back of the room. Agnes lifted one hand and said she could personally verify the provenance of every major object Dean had prepared for removal. Marta, from the staff table, said in a voice louder than I had ever heard from her that 3 crates were already in the carriage house and contained pieces never authorized for transport. Now the room truly belonged to me. And once I felt that shift, once I knew Dean understood he had not merely lost the house but lost the version of himself he liked best, I gave him the one thing he had spent 6 months trying to take from me. Narrative. I told the room who Rosehall actually was. Not a distressed asset. Not a repositioning opportunity. Not a luxury retreat waiting for brand coherence. I told them Eleanor died asking me not to let men in good shoes empty the soul out of the place. I told them I restored it not as a shrine but as a working inheritance. I told them my daughter was meant to build here and my granddaughter was meant to feel rooted here. I told them a house can survive debt, bad seasons, cancellations, and winter repairs, but it cannot survive people who learn to speak of memory as inventory and family as transitional friction. When I finished, the silence in that ballroom was not polite anymore. It was judgment. Dean saw it. You can always tell when men like him recognize the room has turned. Their anger comes up through the floor. He stepped away from his chair, face gone flat and mean in a way I had only glimpsed before. He said I was senile if I thought public theatrics changed business reality. He said Rosehall was already bleeding and sentiment would finish the job. He said I had never understood scale, return, or what it takes to keep a property like this alive. And then, because rage loosens stupid things, he said the sentence that closed the lid. If I had not stepped in, he said, this place would have sat here as your expensive little mausoleum until the county cut it up and sold it by the acre. Eleanor's portrait hung 15 feet behind him. There are moments when even the dead seem to lean closer. I looked at Dean and told him he had mistaken stewardship for hunger because hunger was the only language he trusted. Then I told him Rosehall would remain open, profitable, and intact long after his creditors learned to spell his name correctly in court. That was the cue. The woman from the Attorney General's Financial Fraud Unit stood with 2 county investigators who had arrived quietly during the fish course. Dean saw the badges and actually took half a step back. Not a lot. Just enough for the room to register the animal truth of him. They did not arrest him there. This was not a melodrama with handcuffs between dessert and coffee. Real ruin moves with paperwork first. They identified themselves, asked for his devices and all current business records related to Rosehall gatherings, Halstead Hospitality Advisory, and any transactions involving Marigold House or Larch and Wren. Simone Acker requested counsel immediately. Sensible woman. Vanessa stayed seated. I do not think she yet understood which loss would hurt worst. The husband. The money. The humiliation. Or the fact that I had built a structure strong enough to survive without her once she stopped behaving like family. Olive was not in the room. I need you to know that. I had arranged earlier in the day for Agnes to take her and 2 other children from the staff families up to the old greenhouse cottage with cocoa, a movie, and enough sugared almonds to make them slightly lawless. There are some scenes children should never have to memorize. When the investigators finished the first formal requests and the room dissolved into tight knots of whispering people who would later pretend they had always suspected something, I walked into the service corridor and leaned against the wall for exactly 12 seconds. No more. Revenge is exhilarating in the instant and expensive in the body directly after. I felt every one of my 67 years then. My knees. My spine. The old ache under my left shoulder blade that arrives when I have been too angry for too long. I closed my eyes, counted to 12, straightened, and walked back into the ballroom because the night was not finished and Rosehall deserved to be the final thing standing in its own room. The public part of the revenge came first. The private part came later. Vanessa found me in the blue morning room after most guests had gone. The candles there had burned low. Outside the windows the east lawn was silver with frost. She shut the door behind her and stood with both hands at her sides, palms open, like a woman approaching a dog she was no longer sure would recognize her. I should have told you, she said. Yes. I should have stopped him. Yes. I didn't know about the texts. I believed that. I didn't know he had written me into a payout either. That I believed too. Then she said the thing that mattered more than all of it. I knew enough. There is a point in every family betrayal when the liar finally stops negotiating for innocence and begins speaking in weight. Vanessa had reached it. I waited. Tears had ruined the powder under her eyes. Good. Let her wear the night honestly for once. He kept telling me you would never really let me own Rosehall while you were alive, she said. He said I was running a world-class property while still asking permission like a daughter in my own house. He said if we didn't move fast, you would eventually pull everything back and leave me with the work and none of the power. He said the sale was temporary, that Marigold would restore the estate and then we could buy and hire later. I wanted to believe him because I was tired. There it was. Not greed exactly. Fatigue sharpened into vanity. One of the oldest routes to ruin. I asked her whether she had known about the crates. Yes. The valuation tags. Yes. The founder's suite conversion for the blue room. A pause. Yes. I looked at my daughter a long time then. People assume betrayal kills love cleanly. It does not. It leaves it breathing under rubble, which is much worse. I told Vanessa that Dean would never set foot in Rosehall again. I told her Rosehall gatherings was suspended pending full forensic accounting and that every deposit would be audited before any spring events were honored or released. I told her she would move with Olive into the West Cottage for the time being because I would not let my granddaughter sleep inside a main house full of investigators and seized computers. And then I told her the rest. Under Mercer Rosehall Trust, she remained a conditional beneficiary. Not an owner. Not an operator. A beneficiary. If she wanted any future at Rosehall beyond visiting rites and holiday meals, she would earn it under terms I wrote, not ones Dean whispered. She would account for every dollar. She would apologize to every vendor left unpaid by decisions she helped conceal. She would tell Olive the truth in language that did not use me as a villain or Dean as a misunderstood visionary. And for 1 full year she would hold no authority over the estate whatsoever. She took that like the sentence it was. Then she asked whether I still loved her. That is the sort of question women ask when they already know love is the reason punishment hurts so much. I told her love was not the issue. Trust was. And trust, once stripped for parts, takes longer to restore than plaster. Dean tried twice in the following week to contact me directly. The first message came through my phone just after 8 in the morning 3 days after 12th night. It was exactly what I expected. Not apology. Pressure dressed as pragmatism. He wrote that public emotion had complicated a solvable business matter and that we should speak before outside authorities overinterpreted internal family documents. Internal family documents. As if theft becomes domestic once you say it softly enough. I did not answer. The second time he sent flowers. White lilies. I had them put in the staff lavatory and left there until they began to smell like their real purpose. By the end of January, the consequences started landing in ways even Dean could understand. Marigold House withdrew and immediately filed its own claim, asserting it had been induced into due diligence under false authority representations. Larch and Wren denied direct knowledge of ownership fraud and surrendered all photographic records and intake communications. That alone gave the investigators a clean chain showing what had been targeted and when. 2 brides retained counsel after learning their deposits had not stayed inside Rosehall gatherings. A catering company filed suit. Dean's private guarantee holder accelerated repayment. Creditors who had once been patient because they believed a large property sale was imminent stopped pretending patience was policy and returned to what they had always been. Hungry. And because no revenge is complete until the liar is forced to speak his own scale aloud, Dean was required in deposition to confirm under oath that he had described Rosehall's principal contents as rationalizable non-integral assets in multiple negotiations. Rationalizable non-integral assets. Eleanor would have enjoyed hearing that line read back to her by a woman from the Attorney General's office with a face like winter. The criminal part moved more slowly than my anger wanted and faster than Dean expected. Forgery was not the cleanest charge in the packet because the stewardship agreement stopped short of full execution. But fraud, conspiracy, attempted unlawful conversion of trust property, and several counts tied to deposit diversion and false representations to creditors had enough meat on them to keep multiple offices busy. Dean's attorney worked very hard to turn him into a man crushed by seasonal business pressure who had reached unwisely for complex restructuring while under duress. I almost admired the effort. Almost. The trouble with that argument was that it collided repeatedly with evidence of planning. The tags. The crates. The side agreement. The texts. The creditor schedule. The staged gala announcement. Pressure can explain panic. It does not explain lot sequencing. Vanessa filed for divorce in March. She did not do it bravely. She did it late. Still, late truth is better than permanent rot. By then she had spent 8 weeks in the West Cottage with Olive, accounting line by line for Rosehall gatherings under Julian's supervision and speaking to vendors she had avoided for months. It changed her. Not in one clean cinematic turn. More like weather changes stone. Small abrasions. Some deserved. Some not. The first time I saw a real shift in her was when she came to me with the wedding deposit ledger and pointed quietly to a series of refunds she had assumed were processed but had never actually left the auxiliary account. She did not cry. She did not excuse herself. She simply said I signed off on statements without checking the second account because I didn't want to know how bad it was. That sentence contained more adulthood than anything else she had said in 6 months. So I nodded once and told her to keep going. You may think that sounds cold. Perhaps it is. But some wounds in families do not heal because people apologize beautifully. They heal because somebody finally chooses accuracy over comfort. Rosehall's spring season survived, which angered Dean more than any subpoena ever could. That was another part of the revenge. He wanted the house to need him. I made sure it did not. Ellen helped restructure the operating arm under trust oversight. Julian renegotiated vendor schedules. Agnes supervised the return of every object Dean had moved or prepped. Marta became indispensable and I raised her pay enough to make the idea overdue. Vanessa worked under contract, not authority. She designed events, met clients, and answered to a general manager I hired from outside the family, a 53-year-old widower named Lorraine Westcott who had once run a historic inn in Charleston and had exactly zero interest in charming men with debt. Lorraine is the kind of woman who can remove a man from a service corridor with a glance and still remember to order enough champagne for 300 guests. I hired her on a Wednesday. By Friday, the house felt cleaner. Not quieter. Cleaner. And because no clue in a good story should die unused, the orange tags became part of my final private satisfaction. Agnes and I saved one. Just one. We mounted it in a small shadow box with the lot number visible and the string looped neatly, and I placed it in my study at home above the cabinet where I keep Rosehall's trust papers. Not as a wound. As a warning. A tagged future is still a future if you catch the string before the truck leaves. By early summer, the legal case had forced its way into the local paper. Not the glossy magazine Vanessa once courted, but the paper people actually read. The article was careful, maybe more careful than I would have been if given the pen, but the essentials were there. Historic estate. Attempted distress acquisition. Deposit diversion. Unauthorized contents preparation. Ongoing fraud inquiry. Dean's name sat in print exactly where he could see it over his morning coffee in whatever rental apartment he had downgraded himself into. He called once more after that. Not me. Vanessa. He wanted sympathy then. Claimed I had overreacted. Claimed the investigators had misunderstood the mechanics. Claimed he still loved her and had only ever pushed so hard because he believed Rosehall could become something bigger than the small sentimental business I had trapped it inside. Vanessa listened. Then, because perhaps there is hope for my bloodline after all, she asked whether that bigger future still included her once he took his $425,000 transition fee. Dean hung up. Some truths are too specific to argue with. The real final turn came in late June during the scholarship dinner Eleanor and I began dreaming up before she died. The Mercer House Arts Fellowship supported 5 young musicians every summer with lessons, lodging in the carriage cottages, and access to the music room for practice. We launched it 2 years after Rosehall opened because I wanted one corner of the estate to answer to something larger than weddings and photographs. That year the dinner mattered more than any previous one because it was the first large public event after 12th night where Rosehall would appear not as scandal site or legal matter, but as itself. Dean had once told me nobody wins by embarrassing family publicly. That is one of those statements men make when they have confused family with immunity. I did not invite him, of course. Court conditions made that easy. But I did invite many of the same people who had sat in the ballroom watching his plans split open. Donors. Vendors. County officials. The feature writer. Simone Acker did not receive an invitation, though I heard later Marigold quietly dissolved the Rosehall division entirely. Good. At sunset, as guests moved through the conservatory with glasses of white wine and the fellows tuned strings upstairs, I stood by Eleanor's piano and looked out at the room. Every object Dean had meant to rationalize was where it belonged. The bronze lamp glowed on the library table. The escritoire stood under the window. The carved walnut chairs held a pair of elderly patrons arguing about Brahms. The blue room upstairs contained no founder suite. It contained a quilt, a cedar chest, and Olive's latest obsession, which was a papier-mâché moon hanging slightly crooked over the window because she insisted all well-used rooms required one foolish thing. When it came time for remarks, I did not talk about Dean first. That would have given him lingering ownership of the narrative. I talked about Eleanor. I talked about old houses and the strange burden of stewardship. I talked about how easy it is to confuse value with price if you have never loved anything that couldn't be replaced with cash. Then I thanked the people who stayed when staying became administratively inconvenient. That got a laugh. Then I looked straight at the tables where the donors from 12th night sat and said something I had been saving. The house is safe, I told them. And safety, in my experience, is never an accident. It is made. In paper, in witness, in the courage to read every line before you sign, and in the willingness to call greed by its right name even when it arrives wearing family. That line traveled. People quoted it back to me for months. I do not usually care what lines travel. That one I liked. Later that evening, after the last applause and the first violin of the fellowship recital had turned the music room warm and aching with Bach, Olive climbed onto the window seat in the upstairs hall and leaned against my shoulder. She had grown enough by then that the old lift into my arms was less practical but still requested occasionally on emotional grounds. She looked down toward the front drive, where the lanterns marked the path to the carriages, and asked whether Rosehall would always stay ours now. I considered the question seriously because children deserve accuracy too. I told her Rosehall would stay protected as long as the women in our family remembered that love is not the same thing as paperwork and that houses need both. She thought about that. Then she said that sounded like the sort of lesson grown-ups learned only after making everything harder than necessary. I kissed the top of her head and told her that was an excellent summary of adulthood. She laughed. And in that laugh, sudden and bright and completely uncurated, I heard the thing Eleanor had asked me to preserve without ever using exactly those words. Not the stone. Not the glass. Not even the title. Continuity. The plea hearing came on a gray Tuesday that smelled faintly of wet wool and courthouse coffee. I went because I wanted the state record to contain my face, not just my documents. Dean stood at the defense table in a charcoal suit that fit less well than his old life had. He had lost weight in the mean way some men do when pressure finally finds their actual metabolism. He did not look at me until the prosecutor began reading the factual basis for the plea, and by then looking no longer helped him. The prosecutor read about diverted deposits, false representations to creditors, attempted transfer authority, and coordinated preparations for contents liquidation without ownership consent. She read the text messages aloud. Not every one. Enough. The courtroom clerk had to ask Dean twice to answer clearly when he entered the plea because his first yes came out like a man swallowing glass. I will not pretend I felt nothing tender then. He had once held my granddaughter while she slept. He had once repaired a broken hinge in my pantry without being asked. Human beings do not become easier to destroy simply because they deserve destruction. They remain terribly, annoyingly mixed. That is why judgment is work. Still, when the judge asked whether anyone wished to address the court on the effect of the conduct, I stood. I said Rosehall had survived because structures were finally put in place that should have existed from the beginning. I said attempted theft within families often succeeds because aging parents are taught to read love into access and access into trust. I said no one had merely mishandled business. They had tried to convert lineage into liquidity and called it prudence. The judge, a patient woman with silver hair and a habit of resting one finger on the file edge when she disliked euphemism, thanked me and said the court had no intention of confusing prudence with predation. That line bought me more peace than I expected. Outside on the courthouse steps, Vanessa asked whether I was all right. I told her I was tired, which was the truth, and that tired was not the same thing as sorry. She nodded as if she had expected nothing less. Then, perhaps because hard seasons had finally taught her to stop reaching for the flattering version of events, she asked whether I thought Dean had ever loved Rosehall at all. I answered carefully. I said Dean loved what Rosehall did to rooms when he walked into them with it behind him. That is not the same thing as loving a place. She took that harder than any accusation. Good. Sometimes accuracy is the only inheritance worth giving your grown children. The restitution process became its own bleak little opera. Deposits were repaid in installments once frozen accounts loosened and saleable personal assets were identified. Dean's watch collection lost him several illusions. A sports car disappeared from the story entirely. The downtown membership he used to mention at dinner as if it were a profession went with the first serious attorney invoice. I do not tell you this to sound petty. I tell you because scale matters in revenge. He had planned to sell heirlooms under the language of necessity. I wanted him to experience necessity in things he actually loved. Rosehall's spring weddings returned one by one, though not without cost. Some brides stayed loyal because Vanessa called personally and told the truth in a voice stripped of design. Some left because trust is not refundable on demand. Lorraine rebuilt the books, Marta rebuilt staff morale, and Agnes rebuilt my faith in labels by insisting every restored object receive a fresh trust mark on its underside where no guest could ever see it and no future opportunist could honestly ignore it. Even the Steinway got one, discreet and indelible. Olive recovered in circles. 1 week she would ask nothing and live as if children were meant to move between cottages, main houses, and whispered legal calls on speakerphone. The next she would wake from sleep asking whether houses could know who tried to sell them. I told her yes. Old houses always know. The more useful question is whether the people inside them choose to know in time. She said that seemed unfair to houses. She was right. In late summer, after the plea but before sentencing, Vanessa asked whether we could clear the blue room together. Not clear as Dean meant it. Sort. Reclaim. Decide what remained there because it mattered and what might be moved because life changes honestly too. We spent an afternoon opening cedar boxes, folding quilts, reading 3 indecent letters Eleanor wrote me in 1993, and deciding Olive was old enough for none of them. At one point Vanessa found the old christening gown and sat down on the floor with it in her lap. She said I kept telling myself the deal was temporary because I didn't know how to tell the difference between temporary surrender and permanent damage. I sat on the other side of the room and said most people do not know that difference until after they have paid tuition for it. She laughed through tears at that, which was the first laughter between us in months that did not feel like administrative maintenance. When sentencing finally came, Dean received less time than my anger once wanted and more public shame than his vanity could probably metabolize. That is often the best the law can do. It punishes conduct. It cannot refund atmosphere. It cannot return the winter weeks when every room in your own house feels briefly rented to a stranger's intentions. So I created my own refund where I could. On the anniversary of Eleanor's death, I invited only women to Rosehall for supper. Agnes, Ellen, Marta, Lorraine, Audrey Fitch from the Preservation Board, Corinne from Bellwether House, Vanessa, if she wanted to come not as daughter seeking comfort but as woman willing to help carry chairs and wash glasses. She came. We ate in the library under the bronze lamp Dean once packed away. After dessert I told them I intended to establish one more arm of the trust, a small emergency advisory fund for women over 60 who needed document review, estate guidance, or legal referral before family pressure became family fraud. Nothing huge. Enough to pay an attorney for a day. Enough to stop one signature taken in haste. Agnes said that was the most vindictive philanthropy she had ever heard of. I told her thank you. We named it the Eleanor Mercer Stewardship Fund because she would have liked the irony of her name paying to protect women from charming men with folders. The first year it helped 7 women. One nearly signed over river acreage to a grandson with debt. Another had been told her antique silver was safer in her son's climate-controlled storage than in her own house. I seem to attract a type of story now. I do not mind. Better they come early. By autumn, when the criminal case narrowed in the public imagination and people returned to using Rosehall in magazines as shorthand for romance rather than attempted distress theft, I had learned something I wish I had known 10 years earlier. Older parents are often told that being prepared is cynical. It is not cynical. It is loving the future enough to deny access to the wrong hands. By autumn, the criminal case narrowed. Dean took a plea on multiple counts rather than test his charm against the full documentary record. He lost licenses he valued mostly for the doors they opened. He paid restitution in amounts that hurt but did not equal the damage. Men like him rarely lose in proportion to what they burn. That is one of adulthood's least elegant truths. Raymond Holt settled separately and surrendered his broker status rather than drag his past through another season of hearings. Larch and Wren paid a civil penalty and rewrote half their intake procedures. Marigold House disappeared into a thicket of holding companies and embarrassment. Vanessa kept working under Lorraine for the full year I required. Then I extended it 6 months. Not to punish her. To be sure. She accepted that without argument, which told me more than any apology could have. She stopped using the language Dean loved. No more scale. No more pivot. No more strategic flexibility. She began speaking plainly. Brides. Staff hours. Cost overruns. Linen damage. Rain backup plans. Refund timing. It was not glamorous. It was honest. Honest is how houses survive. The night I finally modified her status under the trust, we sat together in the library after close. No candles. No grand speeches. Just the lamp, tea, and the late scent of roses from the terrace. I told her I was willing to restore partial managerial discretion under Lorraine's oversight if she understood that Rosehall would never again be leveraged for private rescue fantasies, not hers, not a husband's, not anyone's. She said she understood. She said she had begun to understand that being protected by a structure was not the same as being controlled by it. That, too, was an adult sentence. So I signed the amendment. Not because everything was forgiven. Because some things are rebuilt by increments, and I wanted Olive to see at least one woman in her family learn before loss turned final. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you are watching from. It helps this story reach more people who understand how family, money, and trust can become dangerous when the wrong person gets too close. Now I come to Rosehall some mornings before sunrise because old houses tell the truth best before anyone else enters them. Mine is an old stone estate in the foothills where the conservatory turns gray, then silver, then honey when morning comes right. I unlock the front door myself. I still keep Eleanor's photograph on the table just inside the entry hall. The frame is walnut. The glass has a tiny scratch at the lower edge from when Olive tried to polish it with the rough side of a sponge. I left the scratch there because some acts of love should stay visible. I walk the rooms before anyone else arrives. The music room first. Always the music room. I touch the piano sometimes, not to play, because I cannot play, but to remind myself it stayed. I look at the walnut chairs, the plaster medallion overhead, the lamp glow in the library beyond. I listen to the house settle. Old houses speak if you are patient. Not in ghosts. In expansion and memory and the sound of systems doing what they were built to do. People ask now whether I regret building Rosehall at all. No. I regret underestimating how quickly a desperate man can start translating beauty into leverage. I regret waiting as long as I did to hear the warning inside certain questions. I regret assuming my daughter's fatigue would make her reach for me rather than for the first story that promised relief. But I do not regret the house. I do not regret the trust. And I do not regret what I did to stop them. That is the part some people have trouble with. Older fathers are expected to protect family quietly. To pay, forgive, reorganize the table setting, and allow the men in the room to call the violence practical. We are not expected to understand term sheets, trust law, provenance, and extraction codes, then walk into a ballroom full of donors and use every one of those skills like a row of lit matches. Perhaps that is why it worked so well. No one there really expected me to fight in my own language. Dean certainly did not. He thought age had made me sentimental. He thought widowerhood had made me grateful for help. He thought family had made me soft. Instead it had made me meticulous. This is the last thing I want to tell you, and if you take nothing else from me, take this. A house is not safe because people inside it say they love one another. A house is safe because the person who loves it reads the paperwork, knows what belongs to whom, and refuses to let panic rename theft as strategy. If you have property, protect it. If you have children you adore, protect them too, but do not confuse protecting them with financing their self-deception. If someone starts speaking of your home in future tense while standing in your present, pay attention. And if a stranger ever walks through your rooms with orange inventory tags while the man you trusted hides behind a curtain instead of greeting you at the door, do not ask for reassurance. Ask for the contracts. Then calls someone who loves evidence more than charm. The morning after the fellowship dinner, I stood alone in the blue room with the windows cracked open to the September air and looked at the quilt on the cedar chest, the moon Olive had made, and the stripe of light across the floorboards. A year earlier Dean had called it a founder suite. A man with enough debt will rename anything if it helps him imagine taking it. I set my hand on the window latch and thought about how close I had come to mistaking exhaustion for inevitability. Then I laughed. Not loudly. Just once. Because the blue room was still the blue room. Eleanor's lamp was still downstairs. The house was still standing on the bones I paid to strengthen. And the people who tried to auction my future had ended up catalogued instead. That, as far as I am concerned, is the kind of ending a man earns by reading every line.